By early 1944, the Eastern Front had reached a critical phase. The Wehrmacht, once a dominant force pushing deep into Soviet territory, was now in retreat across a broad front. Following the massive German defeat at Stalingrad and the steady rollback through Ukraine in 1943, German forces were increasingly vulnerable. The Red Army's Dnieper-Carpathian offensive had driven the Germans westward, liberating major cities and threatening Axis cohesion in the region. The strategic situation for Germany was deteriorating. Field Marshal Erich von Mannstein, commander of Army Group South, was trying to hold together a fragmented front with diminishing manpower, overstretched supply lines, and wavering Romanian and Hungarian allies. The German High Command, however, was still determined to resist any further Soviet advances into Ukraine. Politically, Ukraine had become one of the most fiercely contested zones in the war. For the Nazis, it was vital for economic and ideological reasons. Ukraine offered fertile agricultural lands, vital resources, and served as a buffer against Soviet resurgence. For the Soviets, Ukraine was a central part of their homeland, and its liberation held immense symbolic and strategic value. The Soviet government pushed for increasingly aggressive offensives to expel German forces from Ukrainian soil, reclaim lost territory, and restore morale across the USSR. In January 1944, the Red Army launched a series of encirclement offensives designed to entrap German formations retreating across the Ukrainian steppe. The idea was to strike where the German front was thin, encircle isolated divisions, and annihilate them before they could regroup. One such offensive was planned near the Dnieper River bend between the towns of Korsun and Cherkasy. This area was held by remnants of German Exellen and Welven Army Corps, comprising several divisions that had already suffered heavily in prior engagements. Although they were intended as a temporary defensive bulwark, these formations were vulnerable to rapid mechanized Soviet movements. German intelligence, though aware of Soviet troop buildup in the region, underestimated the scale and intent of the operation. Soviet forces under Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Ivan Konev began assembling multiple tank and infantry armies to launch a pincer movement from both the north and south of the salient. Their goal was to trap the German units in a pocket, a tactic the Red Army had refined since the battles around Stalingrad and Kursk. By mid-January, the Soviets had massed more than 500,000 men, including the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts, prepared to crush the German presence east of the Dnieper. The terrain around Korsun-Cherkasy was a mix of forested hills and open plains, complicated by poor infrastructure and winter weather. Heavy snow and freezing temperatures made movement difficult, but also offered concealment for Soviet maneuvers. German supply lines were tenuous at best. Bridges were often targeted by Soviet partisans, and Luftwaffe air resupply was becoming increasingly unreliable due to mounting Allied air superiority and logistical shortages. At the higher levels of German command, the situation was not fully grasped. Hitler's strategic interference remained a key issue. He frequently forbade tactical withdrawals, insisting on holding fortress positions regardless of military logic. This ideology of immovable defense turned many German salients into death traps. The Korsun-Cherkasy pocket would become a grim illustration of this policy. Despite warnings from von Mannstein and other generals that the salient was exposed and should be shortened, Hitler refused to allow a retreat. Instead, orders were issued to hold the position at all costs. Meanwhile, the Red Army's momentum was accelerating. Their winter operations in early 1944 aimed not just to recapture lost ground, but to destroy German fighting strength entirely. Their strategy combined operational surprise, overwhelming numbers, and flexible command. Soviet commanders no longer pursued rigid frontal assaults, but sought dynamic encirclements and exploitation. The Korsun-Cherkasy plan reflected this doctrine in full. The pincer was to close rapidly, sealing the pocket and cutting off all routes of escape. On the eve of the Soviet offensive, German soldiers in the region were already facing supply shortages, artillery bombardments, and the ominous sense of impending isolation. Communication between German corps was increasingly disrupted by Soviet interdiction. Weather conditions made reinforcement nearly impossible. Still, morale remained relatively high among German troops. Many believed a breakout or relief operation would come if needed, as had occurred before. But the Soviet High Command was determined that this time there would be no escape. The Soviet offensive commenced on January 24, 1944, with ferocious momentum. The 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts struck simultaneously from the north and south, targeting the flanks of the German-held salient around Korsun and Cherkasy. The 6th Tank Army under General Kravchenko and the 5th Guards Tank Army under General Rotmistrov advanced rapidly, using the cover of snowstorms and thick forests to conceal their movements. The German front lines, already overstretched and poorly supplied, crumbled under the pressure. Soviet forces exploited weak points in the defensive perimeter, bypassing strongholds and severing key roads and communication lines with stunning speed. Within a few days, Soviet spearheads had linked up near the village of Zvenihorodka, effectively encircling 2 German corps, over 50,000 men, inside what would become the Korsun pocket. The encircled forces consisted largely of the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking, 72nd Infantry Division, and elements of the 88th and 389th Infantry Divisions, along with supporting artillery and armor units. These troops were now trapped within a tightening Soviet noose, their fate increasingly dependent on either breakout or rescue. Inside the pocket, German command structures tried to stabilize the situation. General Wilhelm Stemmermann was appointed as commander of the trapped forces, tasked with organizing an all-around defense and coordinating with external relief efforts. Supplies were already running low, especially fuel and ammunition. The Luftwaffe attempted to mount an aerial resupply operation, but poor weather, enemy anti-aircraft fire, and limited aircraft availability meant only a fraction of the needed material reached the encircled units. Meanwhile, the Soviets tightened their grip. Artillery barrages and airstrikes pounded German positions day and night, systematically wearing down defensive strongpoints. Villages within the pocket became focal points of bitter fighting. Civilians caught in the crossfire faced displacement, destruction of property, and in many cases, death. German wounded overwhelmed the field hospitals, and the cold turned every movement into a life-threatening struggle. Horses were slaughtered for food, soldiers melted snow to drink. The pocket was shrinking, and with it, the time available for salvation. To the west, Mannstein organized a relief operation named Operation Wanda, later renamed Operation Conrad. Panzer divisions were redirected to punch through Soviet lines and reach the pocket before it collapsed. The 1st Panzer Division, 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and other elite units were thrown into the assault. The relief effort faced overwhelming difficulties. The terrain was nearly impassable due to snow and mud, Soviet resistance was intense, and fuel shortages plagued German mechanized units. Despite these problems, the relief forces made some progress, pushing toward the Niloy-Tikich River, which marked the western edge of the encirclement. Inside the pocket, Stemmermann's troops mounted desperate counterattacks to maintain supply routes and buy time. But Soviet artillery and armor dominated the battlefield. The Red Army deployed Katyusha rocket launchers, heavy IS-2 tanks, and massed infantry to choke any German attempt at maneuver. Psychological warfare also played a role. Captured Germans were paraded near front lines, loudspeakers blared surrender appeals, and leaflets promised humane treatment for those who laid down arms. Few listened. The German High Command in Berlin remained rigid. Hitler refused to authorize a breakout until the last possible moment, convinced that a full relief was achievable. Mannstein, increasingly frustrated, pleaded for greater freedom of action. As the days passed and Soviet units continued to reinforce the ring, it became clear that time was running out. Soviet generals Konev and Vatutin coordinated closely to prevent any corridor from being opened. Their use of mobile reserves, flexible defense, and preemptive strikes ensured the pocket remained sealed. By early February, the situation had become critical. Communications were breaking down inside the pocket. Fuel was almost gone. Tanks were being destroyed or abandoned. Ammunition stocks were depleted, and casualties mounted daily. Despite the grim outlook, morale among many German soldiers remained high. Belief in eventual rescue, combined with discipline and combat experience, kept units operational, but only just. The stage was set for a final decision. Either the German forces inside Korsun Cherkasy would be relieved, or they would be forced to break out under fire through enemy lines across snow-covered open ground in the dead of winter. The moment of reckoning loomed. As February unfolded, the situation within the Korsun pocket grew increasingly desperate. The encircled German forces under General Stemmermann's command were now effectively cut off from any reliable supply or communication. Harsh winter conditions and unrelenting Soviet attacks had reduced their operational capacity significantly. Although the Luftwaffe continued attempts at aerial resupply, only a fraction of the required food, fuel, and ammunition reached the pocket. Losses among transport aircraft mounted daily. Soviet fighters and flak batteries dominated the skies, rendering most flights perilous or ineffective. Stemmermann began reorganizing the remnants of his units into mobile Kampfgruppen, flexible combined arms battle groups, to counter Soviet thrusts and prepare for a possible breakout. His staff coordinated with the External Relief Force, now under the direct supervision of Field Marshal von Mannstein, who hoped to punch through the Soviet ring from the west. Mannstein's plan centered on a link-up near the Niloy-Tikich River, the point closest to both the encircled forces and the advancing German panzers. Outside the pocket, German forces engaged in Operation Wanda, later called Operation Conrad II, made some tactical gains. Elements of the 1st and 16th Panzer Divisions advanced through heavily contested territory, capturing several key villages. However, the Red Army had anticipated these moves. Soviet reserves, including fresh mechanized corps and heavy artillery batteries, were moved into blocking positions. The terrain, riddled with rivers and bogs, and the persistent snowstorms made maneuvering armored columns extremely difficult. Supply shortages hampered German momentum. Progress was measured in kilometers, often reclaimed the following day by Soviet counterattacks. Within the pocket, the situation approached collapse. German infantry, many suffering from frostbite, malnutrition, and exhaustion, manned trenches carved into frozen soil. Medical conditions were catastrophic. Field hospitals were overwhelmed, lacking both medicine and warmth. Severely wounded men were left to die as evacuation was no longer feasible. Horses were slaughtered systematically to sustain the troops. The bitter cold made even resting a challenge, and morale began to fray at the edges. Still, German command persisted. Stemmermann and his officers maintained strict discipline, rotating frontline units and focusing on conserving strength for an eventual breakout. Soviet tactics evolved in response. Instead of large-scale frontal assaults, Soviet units began probing weak spots, using artillery and snipers to wear down defenders and encroaching village by village. The pocket was compressing, and time was slipping away. Soviet forces now fully controlled the outer perimeter. The Second Ukrainian Front, under General Konev, deployed extensive artillery and tank units to choke any German movement toward the relief forces. The Soviet High Command sought not only to maintain the encirclement, but to annihilate the trapped enemy. The Red Army's priority was destruction, not negotiation. No terms of surrender were offered beyond leaflets and loudspeaker appeals. The lessons of Stalingrad, only a year earlier, had made clear the strategic value of total encirclement and annihilation. On February 10th, after weeks of attritional combat, the German High Command finally authorized a breakout attempt. Mannstein's relief force had advanced as far as Lysyanka, near the Tikich River, but could go no further. Soviet resistance was too strong, and German forces too depleted to open a full corridor. As a result, the only hope for the trapped army was to break out on foot, through snow, across the frozen river, under heavy fire. Stemmermann and his staff planned a night breakout toward Hill 239, south of Lysyanka, where the terrain offered partial cover. The remaining tanks and vehicles were concentrated to provide mobile fire support. The wounded were loaded onto wagons and rear guards were established to delay Soviet reaction. On February 16th, under the cover of darkness and snowfall, over 40,000 men began moving in coordinated columns through the Soviet cordon. The breakout became a harrowing ordeal. Soviet artillery detected movement and opened fire almost immediately. Machine gun nests and anti-tank emplacements inflicted devastating losses. The frozen Tikich River, which had to be crossed, became a killing field. Vehicles sank into the ice or were abandoned. Soldiers slipped, froze, or drowned under fire. Those who made it across had to continue marching through open terrain toward the German lines, with Soviet forces closing in from behind. In the chaos, command and control broke down. Units became separated. Many wounded were left behind. General Stemmermann himself was killed during the breakout, reportedly by Soviet artillery while riding in a half-track. His death dealt a final blow to morale, but the breakout continued in scattered formations. Only a portion of the encircled army, approximately 27,000 men, reached friendly lines. Many were wounded, frostbitten, or permanently incapacitated. Though the Germans had technically achieved a partial breakout, it came at a colossal cost. The Korsun Cherkasy pocket had demonstrated both the determination of the German army and the increasing effectiveness of Soviet encirclement tactics. It also foreshadowed the further collapse of German positions in Ukraine, as Soviet forces prepared for their next offensive. The battlefield lay strewn with corpses, wrecked vehicles, and abandoned equipment, grim evidence of a campaign that had devoured men, machines, and morale. In the immediate aftermath of the breakout attempt, the devastation within and around the Korsun-Cherkasy region was staggering. The area between the Tikich River and the German front lines was littered with bodies, burnt-out vehicles, and abandoned artillery pieces. Entire German battalions had been reduced to scattered remnants. Survivors, many suffering from severe frostbite and exhaustion, arrived at German lines in a state of physical collapse. Hundreds of wounded had been left behind, either unable to make the crossing or abandoned during the retreat under fire. Soviet units swiftly reoccupied the ground and began gathering prisoners, weapons, and evidence of the shattered German formations. For the Red Army, the operation was considered a major success. While some German troops had escaped, Soviet forces had inflicted enormous losses, both in manpower and materiel. The encirclement and partial destruction of 2 German corps demonstrated the effectiveness of evolving Soviet operational doctrine. Unlike earlier in the war, when Soviet armies often relied on rigid frontal attacks, the Korsun-Cherkasy operation had been a well-executed double envelopment, coordinated across 2 fronts with mobile armor units, massed artillery, and well-integrated infantry. The success bolstered Soviet morale and provided valuable experience for upcoming operations aimed at pushing the Wehrmacht further westward. The psychological effect on the German command structure was profound. Although officially framed as a successful breakout, the high losses and the inability of the relief force to fully reach the pocket exposed fundamental weaknesses in German strategic posture. The gap between Hitler's strategic assumptions and the realities on the ground grew ever wider. Despite evidence of deteriorating conditions, Hitler continued to forbid preemptive withdrawals or strategic repositioning. His insistence on holding exposed salients and fortresses at any cost had once again resulted in a near-catastrophic entrapment. The experience of Korsun-Cherkasy became yet another case in which local commanders such as von Mannstein and Stemmermann were forced to improvise under near-impossible constraints. The German relief effort, despite initial tactical successes, had ultimately failed due to a combination of factors: overextended lines, lack of fuel and reserves, adverse weather, and Soviet superiority in artillery and maneuver warfare. German panzer divisions had become shadows of their former strength, their vehicles worn from years of continuous combat, their crews undertrained or exhausted. Luftwaffe air support, once the decisive factor in blitzkrieg operations, was increasingly absent. Allied bombing of fuel depots and transportation networks was beginning to erode the operational flexibility of German ground forces, even on the Eastern Front. Soviet media immediately seized on the victory, broadcasting images of captured German equipment and prisoners. The triumph was depicted as another step toward final victory, reinforcing the narrative of Soviet resilience and superiority. Soviet war correspondents, often embedded with advancing units, reported firsthand on the success of the operation, highlighting the bravery of tank crews and infantrymen. The propaganda value of the operation was immense, especially in the context of ongoing efforts to rally support for the Red Army's continued advance across Ukraine. On the German side, the event was heavily censored. Reports in the German press minimized the extent of the losses, focusing instead on the heroic breakout and the discipline of the retreating troops. Goebbels' propaganda apparatus attempted to portray the event as a testament to German courage and sacrifice rather than strategic failure. But among frontline troops and mid-level officers, the reality was clear. The Eastern Front was slipping beyond German control. In the wider strategic picture, the Korsun-Cherkasy battle marked a turning point in the German defense of Ukraine. Soviet forces had proven their ability to conduct large-scale encirclements with increasing skill and coordination. The operation further disrupted German attempts to stabilize the front line along the Dnieper and created openings for follow-up offensives toward western Ukraine and Romania. With the spring thaw approaching, Soviet planners were already preparing for new campaigns to exploit the disarray of the German southern front. Meanwhile, Axis allies such as Romania and Hungary observed the outcome of Korsun-Cherkasy with growing concern. Their forces had been present in the region and had suffered losses. But more importantly, the battle revealed the vulnerability of German leadership and the increasing inability of the Wehrmacht to protect Axis positions. The battle's outcome contributed to rising instability among Germany's Eastern European partners, some of whom would later begin seeking separate arrangements with the Allies or exploring ways to defect from the Axis alliance altogether. By the end of February 1944, the German military position in southern Ukraine was gravely weakened. The Korsun-Cherkasy operation had not just consumed divisions, it had exposed the systemic weaknesses of the German army's eastern campaign. With Soviet forces now emboldened and experienced, and German forces increasingly reactive and depleted, the Eastern Front's momentum had permanently shifted in favor of the Red Army. The battle for Ukraine was far from over, but its direction had become unmistakably clear. As March 1944 approached, the broader consequences of the Korsun-Cherkasy encirclement rippled across the Eastern Front. The German defeat, though partially masked by propaganda and the narrative of a successful breakout, triggered an undeniable chain reaction of operational collapses throughout southern Ukraine. The Red Army, sensing opportunity and emboldened by its recent success, intensified offensive operations along the entire front, exploiting the weakened German defensive network and pressing towards the strategic Dniester River line. For Army Group South, the capacity to regroup and establish any stable line of defense was rapidly eroding. Following the breakout, the remnants of the Iwas and Excellent Army Corps were in no condition to fight. Units were depleted to skeletal formations, without sufficient vehicles, fuel, or ammunition. Survivors required immediate evacuation, and most were reassigned to rear echelons for rest and reorganization. Crucial defensive positions once held by experienced troops were now manned by understrength formations and hastily assembled battle groups. The Wehrmacht's reserve pool was shallow, and replacements arriving from Germany were often inadequately trained or ill-equipped to cope with the scale and brutality of Soviet warfare. The Soviet command, recognizing the vulnerability in German dispositions, launched the Uman-Bodosani offensive in early March. It aimed to further fracture German lines and push into western Ukraine and northern Romania. Multiple Soviet fronts, coordinated under the direction of Stavka, converged with overwhelming numerical superiority. The Red Army continued its practice of deep operations, coordinated attacks by infantry, armor, artillery, and air support designed to overwhelm defensive lines and penetrate deep into enemy-held territory. The Korsun experience had demonstrated the success of this doctrine and refined its execution. Mannstein, though still commander of Army Group South, faced impossible decisions. He requested permission to conduct a general withdrawal to more defensible positions west of the Dniester. Hitler, however, refused. His orders to hold every position at all costs remained inflexible, regardless of the strategic situation. German corps and divisions were often left exposed in salients or tasked with defending towns of limited military value. These stubborn defense lines became magnets for Soviet encirclements, and German commanders repeatedly found themselves reacting rather than maneuvering. The terrain further compounded German difficulties. Spring brought the Rasputitsa, the seasonal thaw that turned roads and open terrain into impassable mud. Soviet forces, having adapted over years of campaigning, were better prepared for these conditions. They employed light vehicles, pack animals, and mobile engineering units to maintain momentum. German mechanized formations, by contrast, became bogged down. Tanks and trucks were frequently abandoned due to mechanical failure or lack of fuel. Supply chains disintegrated as convoys became trapped or destroyed. Civilians caught between the front lines suffered tremendously. As German units retreated, scorched earth tactics were employed to deny the enemy resources, leading to the destruction of villages, crops, and infrastructure. Retreating German forces often carried out reprisals against suspected partisan collaborators. The Soviet advance, meanwhile, unleashed its own wave of upheaval. Soviet reoccupation brought purges of alleged traitors, forced requisitions, and mass deportations in areas accused of aiding the Germans during the occupation. For the Ukrainian population, the shifting front lines meant repeated cycles of devastation and repression, regardless of the flag flying overhead. In Berlin, the high command was divided. While field commanders like Mannstein, Model, and others advocated tactical withdrawals to preserve combat strength and shorten supply lines, Hitler's directives remained rigid. He accused generals of defeatism and demanded loyalty over pragmatism. This tension culminated in late March with Mannstein's dismissal. He was replaced by General Walter Model, known for his defensive acumen and personal loyalty to Hitler. Yet even Model's reputation for crisis management could not compensate for the growing material and manpower disparities between Germany and the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Soviet forces advanced steadily toward major cities like Vinnytsia and Kamianets-Podilsky, opening the door to the encirclement of yet another German force, the 1st Panzer Army, in what would become the next major Soviet operation. The Korsun-Cherkasy battle had exposed the feasibility of large-scale Soviet encirclements and signaled to both sides that the German army could no longer conduct prolonged campaigns in the open without risking collapse. By April 1944, German control in Ukraine had been pushed to the brink. Axis satellite armies, such as those of Romania and Hungary, were demoralized and suffering growing losses. Communications between German units were increasingly disrupted by partisan activity and Soviet penetrations. Rail hubs critical for logistics were under threat or already in Soviet hands. The sense of impending collapse was now undeniable, among field officers, among junior soldiers, and even in whispered corridors of the German General Staff. The defeat at Korsun-Cherkasy, though one among many setbacks, had revealed the accelerating deterioration of German military capability in the East. It was not only a matter of manpower or equipment, it was strategic momentum that had irrevocably shifted. The Red Army was no longer reactive but initiatory, setting the tempo, choosing the battles, and reshaping the map of Eastern Europe one encirclement at a time. As the spring of 1944 progressed, the Red Army's momentum became unstoppable across the southern sectors of the Eastern Front. The strategic aftermath of the Korsun-Cherkasy operation had not only weakened Army Group South, but shattered the illusion of German tactical superiority in mobile warfare. While earlier Soviet victories had been costly, often relying on numerical advantage, operations like Korsun showcased increasing Soviet proficiency in coordination, encirclement tactics, and the exploitation of German rigidity. What began as a localized disaster now rippled into the broader collapse of German lines across Ukraine. In March and April, the Soviet High Command launched the Proskurov-Chernovtsi offensive, another deep penetration maneuver designed to trap the German 1st Panzer Army. The Red Army's goal was clear: to encircle and destroy large German formations before they could withdraw behind the Carpathians. This pattern, isolate, encircle, annihilate, was now being executed with frightening regularity. German units, still constrained by Hitler's standing orders to hold ground at all costs, found themselves repeatedly caught in salients and vulnerable to rapid Soviet thrusts through their flanks. The terrain of western Ukraine presented new challenges. Mountainous regions, river valleys, and urban centers slowed Soviet advances but did little to aid the defense. German forces were operating in an increasingly hostile environment. Supply lines were thin, local resistance was rising, and morale was deteriorating. Partisan activity surged behind German lines. Rail lines were sabotaged, supply depots destroyed, and isolated garrisons harassed. In response, German rear area commands conducted brutal anti-partisan operations, further alienating the civilian population and compounding their logistical problems. Within the Wehrmacht itself, structural decay was evident. Many veteran divisions had been destroyed or reduced to fragments. Replacements arriving from Germany were increasingly younger, less trained, and poorly equipped. Divisions were reconstituted using survivors from previous battles, second-line troops, and Luftwaffe ground personnel. Even elite units such as the Waffen-SS division suffered from severe depletion. The lack of fuel and spare parts rendered many panzer formations ineffective. Heavy armor was often left behind or used as static defense due to mobility constraints. By contrast, Soviet industrial output was now peaking. T-34 tanks, Katyusha rocket launchers, and Yakovlev fighters poured into the front. Supply chains had been reorganized and optimized, often with American Lend-Lease trucks and equipment supporting logistics. Soviet commanders had developed standardized procedures for operational breakthroughs with multiple echelons of forces. Shock armies would breach the line, mechanized corps would exploit the gap, and follow-up infantry would secure the flanks and hold territory. These tactics, coupled with superior numbers and growing air dominance, overwhelmed German defenses repeatedly. Soviet soldiers also began encountering growing numbers of abandoned German equipment, guns, vehicles, and even intact field positions. These scenes reflected not only material shortages, but a psychological shift. German troops who once believed in the inevitability of victory now spoke in terms of survival. Desertion increased. Rumors of Soviet advances into Romania and the Balkans further eroded morale. Even officers questioned the viability of continued resistance, especially as orders from above remained inflexible and detached from frontline reality. Amid these military developments, the civilian toll remained catastrophic. Ukrainian villages and towns, having endured years of German occupation, were now caught in the chaos of liberation and retribution. Some locals welcomed Soviet troops as liberators, while others, fearing NKVD reprisals or forced conscription, fled westward. Soviet authorities quickly reinstated control over retaken territories, establishing military administrations, deporting suspected collaborators, and imposing political order. The memory of the Holodomor, Stalinist purges, and forced collectivization lingered, complicating the Red Army's relationship with the local population. In Berlin, the reaction to these losses oscillated between denial and desperation. Hitler remained convinced that his positional defense strategy would exhaust the Soviet offensive capacity. He ordered new fortress cities to be designated, with instructions to hold them to the last man. In reality, these declarations led only to the sacrifice of garrisons without strategic gain. German radio broadcasts focused on Western Front developments, the Allied bombing campaign, and V-weapon propaganda, anything to divert attention from the scale of the collapse in the East. Yet within the German General Staff, a grim consensus was forming. The war in the East could no longer be won, only prolonged. The destruction at Korsun Cherkasy, followed by successive defeats at Uman, Tarnopol, and Kamianets-Podilsky, revealed the futility of continued offensives or even large-scale defensive maneuvers. There were no more reserves, no more breakthroughs, only delay. As April gave way to May, the last German positions in southern Ukraine were being abandoned or overrun. Soviet forces crossed the Dniester, threatening Romania and opening the path into the Balkans. The German retreat was no longer orderly. Units collapsed, command structures disintegrated, and entire corps disappeared into the encroaching Soviet tide. The collapse of the German Southern Front was no longer theoretical. It was underway, and the consequences would soon reshape the entire strategic landscape of Eastern Europe. By May 1944, the German military situation in Ukraine had deteriorated beyond repair. The Red Army's relentless offensives, building on the momentum from Korsun Cherkasy, had not only devastated German frontline formations, but also shattered the infrastructure necessary to sustain large-scale defensive operations. As the Wehrmacht retreated westward, its ability to mount effective resistance became increasingly reliant on localized improvisation and battlefield leadership rather than coherent strategic planning. Among German commanders, the urgency of adaptation became paramount. In the absence of sufficient reinforcements or equipment, they turned to constructing layered field defenses, using terrain and what remained of the fortification network built during earlier phases of occupation. Makeshift strongpoints were established in villages and along river crossings, supported by whatever artillery could be salvaged. Anti-tank ditches, mines, and concealed gun emplacements were employed to stall advancing Soviet armor. In many areas, these temporary measures bought days, sometimes hours, but never reversed the tide. Within the German ranks, resilience persisted, but morale was strained to the breaking point. Exhausted infantry units, deprived of sleep and consistent rations, were rotated through collapsing lines with little sense of larger operational coherence. Supply shortages meant that ammunition was rationed, and the use of heavy weapons was often restricted to key engagements only. Fuel was reserved for staff cars and ambulances, with armored vehicles sometimes towed into position, used as static defenses. Discipline eroded. Cases of insubordination and desertion, once rare, became more frequent. Some units began withdrawing early without orders, anticipating encirclement. The Soviets, by contrast, continued to evolve their methods. With Ukrainian terrain now familiar and the logistics tail stabilized by Lend-Lease transport vehicles, Soviet mechanized units pushed deeper, bypassing centers of German resistance and aiming for strategic rear positions. The 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts moved toward the Carpathians, while the 3rd Ukrainian front pressed toward the Dniester Delta. Deep reconnaissance detachments disrupted German communication and coordination, targeting field HQs, signal posts, and bridges. Innovation in Soviet tactics became evident. Mobile artillery was increasingly paired with forward observers and ground attack aircraft to deliver precise strikes on known German positions. Engineer battalions bridged rivers under fire within hours, allowing armored thrusts to continue with minimal delay. Soviet commanders also began integrating intelligence from captured German maps and radio intercepts, enabling more flexible responses to Wehrmacht maneuvers. Partisan groups, now emboldened by the proximity of Red Army units, expanded their activities. In western and central Ukraine, they launched ambushes, sabotaged rail lines, and guided Soviet troops through less defended corridors. Though their coordination with regular Soviet forces was not always formalized, the cumulative effect was significant. German convoys increasingly required armed escort, stretching already thin frontline manpower further. Faced with this multi-directional threat, the Wehrmacht resorted to extreme measures. Forced conscription of ethnic Germans from Ukraine and Romanian territories was accelerated. SS units were deployed to rear areas to police retreating troops and suppress panic. Field military courts handed down summary executions for perceived cowardice or desertion. In many instances, commanders were ordered to stand their ground in clearly untenable positions, the same command logic that had led to the Korsun Cherkasy disaster just months earlier. Amid the chaos, isolated acts of determined resistance emerged. At places like Kolomaya and Chernivtsi, ad hoc battle groups formed by elements of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS managed to delay Soviet advances temporarily. In some cases, these groups coordinated air cover with what remained of the Luftwaffe's tactical squadrons. These actions, however, were exceptions, symbolic of a disciplined military tradition, but ultimately unable to influence the broader strategic picture. The civilian population continued to suffer gravely. As German forces retreated, they employed scorched earth tactics once again, destroying bridges, blowing up warehouses, and burning fields. Local populations, caught between punitive German withdrawal and aggressive Soviet advance, endured looting, forced labor, and widespread displacement. Soviet reprisals against those deemed collaborators were swift and severe. Entire families were deported to Siberia on suspicion alone, and former auxiliary police units, many composed of local Ukrainians, faced execution or summary trials. By late May, the Red Army had secured most of western Ukraine. The Carpathian foothills became the new front line, and the stage was set for operations into Romania and Hungary. German forces, now rebranded as Army Group North Ukraine under Walter Model, attempted to fortify this new defensive belt. Yet even these measures were temporary. Soviet planners already viewed these regions as the next targets in the widening campaign to dismantle the Axis alliance in the east. The adaptation of Soviet strategy, combined with the collapse of German cohesion and the systematic targeting of rear areas, transformed the nature of warfare in Ukraine. Korsun Cherkasy was no longer an isolated calamity. It had marked the beginning of a relentless Soviet pursuit that now reached the very borders of the Axis world. The German army, though still dangerous and disciplined in pockets, was no longer the master of the Eastern theater. It was now, unambiguously, on the run. By the summer of 1944, the final strategic implications of the Korsun-Cherkasy catastrophe became unmistakable. The Wehrmacht's capacity to maintain a continuous defensive line in Ukraine had collapsed. While local resistance and counterattacks continued, the momentum of German operations was no longer dictated by choice or initiative, but by the relentless advance of the Red Army and the impossibility of maintaining overstretched frontages. The breakthrough at Korsun had served not only as a military victory for the Soviets, but as a tactical blueprint for further encirclements and a psychological turning point in the Eastern Front campaign. The turning point came with the launch of Operation Bagration in June 1944. Though concentrated primarily against Army Group Center in Belarus, its impact was felt across the entire Eastern Front. German reserves and attention were diverted northward, further depriving Army Group North Ukraine of the means to defend its positions. The Soviet General Staff, recognizing the exhaustion of German forces in the south and their strategic overextension, initiated a new offensive through the Carpathian region and into eastern Poland and Romania. These operations exploited the vulnerabilities exposed by the failure at Korsun, pressing forward with overwhelming force. The breakthrough into Romania signified more than just another territorial gain. It marked the unraveling of Germany's Eastern Alliance system. The Romanian government, long aware of Germany's weakening grip, interpreted the Soviet advance as both a military threat and a political opportunity. In August 1944, King Michael II orchestrated a coup against the pro-German Antonescu regime and announced Romania's defection from the Axis. This dramatic reversal opened the southern flank of the German front to Soviet exploitation. German troops stationed in Romania suddenly found themselves isolated, outnumbered, and without secure supply routes. German efforts to stem the collapse included desperate defensive actions along the Carpathian passes and in the cities of Lviv, Ternopil, and Stanislau, now Ivano-Frankivsk. In these areas, surviving elements from earlier engagements such as Korsun-Cherkasy were reinforced with Waffen-SS and Luftwaffe ground units. Field Marshal Model, who had replaced Mannstein, attempted to reorganize these remnants into coherent formations. His command style emphasized discipline and improvised defense, but even he acknowledged that without air superiority, fuel, or reserves, such efforts were at best delaying actions. The Red Army, meanwhile, began adapting its pace to reflect new logistical challenges. While pursuing German units westward, they paused at key intervals to reinforce gains and deploy support units. Soviet armored columns were now supported by long-range artillery and better road networks, in contrast to the muddy, improvised paths of previous years. The advance across the Dniester through Bukovina and into Transylvania demonstrated a level of operational coordination the Germans had once believed the Soviets incapable of achieving. In this broader context, the failed breakout at Korsun became part of a growing list of German disasters. As historians would later analyze, Korsun was not merely an isolated encirclement. It was a rehearsal for what became a Soviet doctrine of operational annihilation. Just as Soviet forces had studied German blitzkrieg methods in earlier years, they now applied their own variant: rapid breakthroughs, double envelopments, and deep exploitation. These tactics were repeated on a much larger scale in Bagration and in the destruction of Army Group South Ukraine. The impact on German morale was devastating. For frontline troops, the realization that even well-fortified, coordinated forces like those at Korsun could be encircled and nearly annihilated cast a long shadow. Rumors of Soviet atrocities, fear of captivity, and the collapse of Allied Axis support led many soldiers to question their chances of survival. For officers, the increasing interference of Hitler and the OKW created a command climate of paralysis and despair. Orders were often contradictory or issued too late to be meaningful. Even Model, despite his reputation, could not repair the fracture between strategic reality and Hitler's ideological demands. On the home front, German civilians began to understand the true nature of the war's course. Refugee columns from the east poured into Central Europe, bringing stories of lost towns, massacres, and hopeless resistance. The defeat in Ukraine and the collapse of German control in the Balkans shattered the myth of Eastern invincibility that had been cultivated since 1941. German newspapers avoided reference to places like Korsun or Kamianets-Podilsky, focusing instead on vague reports of repositioning and tactical withdrawals. Yet, despite the scope of the disaster, the German army continued to fight. The traditions of the general staff, battlefield cohesion, and individual bravery remained intact. Panzer units staged counterattacks in Hungary, delaying Soviet advances toward Budapest. Infantry divisions fought desperate rearguard actions in the passes of the Carpathians, often buying time for civilians and fellow soldiers to escape. But it was a defense without end, conducted in the shadow of inevitable defeat. The turning point that Korsun-Cherkasy represented had now evolved into irreversible strategic collapse. The Red Army's advance had breached not only German lines, but the political and military coherence of the Axis position in Eastern Europe. Each new Soviet thrust now pushed toward Berlin itself, and the ghosts of Korsun marched with them. By the final months of 1944, the broader collapse initiated at Korsun-Cherkasy had cascaded into a continental unraveling of the German Eastern War effort. The German retreat from Ukraine was no longer measured in kilometers, but in the strategic loss of entire regions, allies, and political influence. The Red Army's advance had transformed from a sequence of operations into a continuous surge, steadily crushing German military formations and political alliances alike. The question was no longer whether Germany could hold the East, but how long it could delay its total collapse. One of the most critical repercussions of the Korsun-Cherkasy campaign was the chain of encirclement doctrines it helped refine. These encirclements, repeated with frightening effectiveness in Belarus, the Baltic states, and later in Hungary, exploited a consistent German flaw: the refusal to conduct timely withdrawals. Hitler's obsession with no-retreat positions continued to paralyze German field command. As with Korsun, where an earlier evacuation might have saved tens of thousands, the refusal to adapt turned each defensive pocket into a trap. The Red Army now anticipated this pattern. It became a predictable and exploitable aspect of German behavior. Meanwhile, the operational tempo of the Soviets remained high. Their offensives were no longer seasonal but continuous. With Soviet forces advancing through Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and into Yugoslavia and Slovakia, the Axis position in southeastern Europe unraveled. German forces were forced into long and vulnerable lines of retreat across mountainous and rural terrain, which were routinely ambushed or overtaken by Soviet mechanized units. German High Command, though aware of these vulnerabilities, lacked the reserves, air cover, or transport capacity to extricate endangered units quickly. The collapse of Axis satellite forces further compounded the problem. After Romania's defection in August 1944, Bulgaria followed suit. Hungary, still nominally loyal, descended into political chaos. The Germans attempted to secure Hungary with military force. including the deployment of elite Waffen SS divisions and ad hoc formations, but their capacity to project power had diminished significantly. The moral authority of the German command was also waning. Collaborationist governments fell or were overthrown. Puppet regimes collapsed. Even pro-German militias began surrendering or switching allegiances to avoid Soviet retribution. Back in the German Reich, the psychological impact of these defeats was becoming unbearable. The memory of Stalingrad had already shaken public confidence. Now, the scale of Soviet victories in Ukraine and beyond turned despair into inevitability. Nazi propaganda continued its defiant tone, speaking of total war and final victory, but the credibility of these pronouncements was gone. Refugees fleeing westward outnumbered reinforcements going east. Cities such as Lviv and Krakow prepared for defense but expected no lasting relief. Among Wehrmacht officers, the lessons of Korsun were widely understood but rarely acknowledged aloud. It had revealed more than just tactical misjudgments. It exposed the structural failure of Germany's command system. No amount of bravery or tactical ingenuity could overcome a leadership that refused to heed the warnings of its most capable field commanders. This realization fostered an atmosphere of resignation within many divisions. They would fight, but they no longer believed it would change the war's outcome. The Red Army, in contrast, gained not only territory but confidence. Its ranks swelled with veterans of successful operations. Entire generations of officers who had learned under fire now commanded armies with operational independence and coordination. Logistics remained a challenge, especially as the front extended into Central Europe, but the Soviets had streamlined their supply networks, often aided by captured Axis stockpiles and Lend-Lease shipments from the West. The psychological edge now belonged fully to the Soviet side. The myth of German invincibility, carefully crafted from the 1940 Blitzkrieg through to early victories in the Soviet Union, had been permanently destroyed. In its place stood a new image, the relentless Soviet juggernaut, impossible to stop, impossible to avoid, absorbing every blow and responding with crushing force. For German soldiers, the fear of Soviet captivity, shaped by tales from Stalingrad and now Korsun, became a decisive factor in their behavior. Many chose to retreat prematurely or surrender to Western allies when possible. As autumn gave way to winter, the final Soviet campaigns of the year pushed toward the gates of Budapest and into Slovakia. The once formidable army group south had fractured. What remained of the divisions that had fought at Korsun were dispersed, absorbed into other commands, or destroyed in later operations. German attempts to mount a counteroffensive, such as the ill-fated Operation Conrad in Hungary, failed to replicate earlier models of tactical brilliance. The era of fluid German warfare in the East had ended. It had died in part in the snows of Korsun. Now the final phase of the war approached. The Oder River line, the defense of the Reich itself, and the inevitable confrontation in Berlin were all becoming real. The lessons of Korsun Cherkasy would be remembered in the planning rooms of both the Red Army and the Wehrmacht, not as an isolated event, but as the symbol of a turning tide that could no longer be reversed. The legacy of the Korsun Cherkasy encirclement extends far beyond the battlefield itself. In military terms, it marked the confirmation of a strategic reality that had been building since the Soviet victory at Stalingrad, that the Red Army had not only recovered from the disasters of 1941-42, but had matured into a force capable of planning and executing complex, large-scale operations with precision and overwhelming force. Korsun was one of the final nails in the coffin of German offensive capability in the East. It demonstrated the irreversible shift in initiative from the Wehrmacht to the Red Army and established a new phase of warfare, one in which Germany could only react and delay, never dictate. The battle also had a profound psychological effect, particularly within the ranks of the German army. Unlike the earlier disaster at Stalingrad, where the Sixth Army had been cut off deep within Soviet territory, the Korsun pocket formed relatively close to the German main line, within what many still considered defensible terrain. That an entire corps-sized force could be encircled and nearly annihilated, despite being within potential reach of reinforcement or withdrawal, shattered the remaining illusions of German operational flexibility. It also underscored the fatal consequences of Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs, even when such positions were tactically untenable. In Soviet historiography, Korsun Cherkasy was remembered as one of the most successful operational-level encirclements of the war. It became a textbook example taught in post-war Soviet military academies, a symbol of the maturing Soviet doctrine of deep battle, where successive echelons of forces worked in coordination to trap and eliminate enemy groupings. Soviet commanders such as Konev and Vatutin gained recognition for their roles in orchestrating the encirclement. For the Red Army, Korsun was both a victory in itself and a stepping stone to greater campaigns to come. For Ukraine, the battle left scars that would endure long after the war's end. The central Ukrainian countryside where the fighting occurred was devastated. Towns such as Korsun, Zvenigorod and Lysyanka became names synonymous with suffering and destruction. Civilian casualties mounted not only from the fighting but from the reprisals, deportations, and scorched earth policies employed by both sides. Soviet reoccupation brought with it renewed purges, forced collectivization, and mass arrests of those suspected of aiding the Germans, including many who had done so under duress or for survival. In post-war Europe, the battle contributed to the redrawing of political and ideological boundaries. The destruction of the German Southern Front facilitated the Soviet entry into Eastern Europe, enabling the occupation of Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, and, by extension, the expansion of the Soviet sphere of influence. The path to post-war Soviet dominance in the region was paved through places like Korsun, where German defenses crumbled and the Red Army advanced unopposed. Among military historians, the Korsun-Cherkasy operation continues to be studied not only for its tactical and operational dimensions, but also for what it reveals about the state of both combatants in the second half of the war. It reflected a critical convergence: the exhaustion of German resources, the limitations of Hitler's command structure, and the growing capability of Soviet planners to exploit those vulnerabilities. The battle remains a stark illustration of the consequences of misjudged strategy and rigid ideology in modern warfare. In modern memory, however, Korsun remains somewhat overshadowed by larger and more widely known engagements: Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin. Yet for the soldiers who fought there, it was no less apocalyptic. The frozen rivers, the encirclement under artillery fire, the desperate breakout across snowfields under machine gun fire, these scenes were etched into the memories of the survivors. For many, Korsun was not merely another battle, but a symbol of a war that had turned against them, in a place where escape came not through victory, but through endurance and loss. Ultimately, Korsun Cherkasy stands as a grim milestone on the road to Germany's defeat in the East. It encapsulates the transformation of the Eastern Front from a theater of German initiative to one of Soviet ascendancy. The battle was not decisive in isolation, but it was definitive in what it represented. From its snow-covered plains emerged a new reality. The Wehrmacht was no longer advancing, no longer choosing the time or place of engagement. The war was coming home, and the road led west.